Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff coming to you from Ra'anana, right outside of Tel Aviv. Big week here in Israel, and I know that's why so many of you are tuning in right now. So you can get the real story of this hostage deal that just went down today here in Israel. It's a really complicated agreement. As I'm going to explain to you, it's not nearly as good as it might sound on paper or on screen. What I'm going to try to do today is help you understand what the deal actually entails, explain to you why virtually no Israeli fully supports it. And that includes myself. I support it. I'm glad the deal is happening. If I had to vote, I would have voted for the deal rather than against it. But no one fully supports it because, well, for reasons that I will go into. We're actually going to begin with your questions because a lot of you wrote in with questions, and I think these questions will be a good precursor for what's going to follow. It also shows everyone else where you're at and what's on your minds. So, Clyde wrote in on CBC, this is in Canada, the Canadian national broadcaster. They keep saying that most of the prisoners in the Israeli jails have been held without being charged. I assume you're going to be talking about this later on, wondering what you know. Is this true or not? So, Clyde, there is a clause here in Israel that allows courts to hold certain prisoners without being charged. At one point, they were also holding some of the settlers in the West Bank without being formally charged, but they had intelligence and pretty much knew that these settlers were involved in torching the homes of Palestinians in the West Bank. So, yeah, in Israel, there is such a thing as holding suspects without charging them. I think it can be for quite some time in the case of Palestinian potential terrorists. Now, you said that they said most of the prisoners were being held without being charged. I can't comment on the most part. I don't know whether it was most or some, but there is such a thing in Israel that prisoners or that suspects can be held without charge for certain types of crimes against the state, terrorism related crimes. Okay. The next question comes from, I'll just call this person S. I don't want to divulge their identity because it's a little bit of a powerful statement question. S writes in, I'm overjoyed that three hostages, and by the way, I should name the hostages. It's Romi, Emily, and Doron from the south of Israel. I am overjoyed that these three hostages were released today. I am terrified, however, about the Palestinian prisoners and terrorists that are going to be released and the rest of them that will be released as the result of this quote unquote temporary pause to the fighting. And then this person goes on to write, I know a lot of people will not like to hear this, but I think Israel just needs to go badass and level Gaza. People say it's easy for me to say this because I don't have family members being held hostage in Gaza. This is true. But if I did, I would not want Israel to release terrorists in order to get me or my family members back. I would want them to destroy Hamas's ability and put an end to them. I also don't understand why Israel is agreeing to getting hostages out in stages rather than getting them out all at once. A lot can happen over the next few weeks. The hostages that are still there may not even be alive when it's time for them to be released. What are your thoughts? So, really quickly, I would say that there are definitely some Israelis who agree with this person that we should just level Gaza, including possibly any hostages that we weren't able to get out. Some people simply do the math that at this point we've lost over 400 soldiers. We know that of the 97 soldiers now in Gaza, that of the 97 hostages still in Gaza right now, 34 of them are no longer alive. So that means at best 63 living hostages. And one of the thoughts is sacrifice these 63, but wipe out Gaza completely. Just obliterate Gaza and get rid of the entire problem. It's hard for me on air to say that I would agree with this kind of a thing, but there are certainly people in Israel who agree 100% with that sentiment. Um, and maybe there's a mathematical argument to be made for it that releasing all of these prisoners could lead to the deaths of more than, God forbid, but more than 63, which is the number of living hostages we believe are in Gaza right now. So, one could make that argument. I would argue that for the health of Israel, that for the health of our country, to stand up to the values that we believe in, we cannot do that kind of a thing. Um, Golda Meir has that famous quote: "We can forgive our enemies for killing our children, but we can never forgive our enemies for turning our children into killers." The idea being that we need to be different from our enemies. That what really differentiates us from our enemies is not just our ethics, our beliefs, but what we do on the battlefield and how we behave. And we do not want to be like them. We do not want to stoop to their level. So I certainly see this argument. I won't lie to you. I've at times thought it myself, but I think at the end of the day, it would be very, very bad for Israel's soul if we were to simply carpet bomb Gaza and wipe it out, including our own hostages. Once our hostages are out, maybe a different story. We'll get to that part too later on. Okay. Iris asks, "Hey, Joel, I thought the terrorists that were being released were going to Gaza or Turkey. Why are they going to the West Bank?" So sadly, you are incorrect. They are not going to Gaza and Turkey. Most of the 90 that are released this week, I believe 78, are going to the West Bank. I don't know why, and I agree with you, Iris. It would be much better if they went to Gaza because at least then we could keep them out of Israel. Once they're in the West Bank, it's much easier for them to slip out of whatever Palestinian village they are in and into an Israeli area, a Jewish area. Um, and this goes back to the previous person who wrote in: is why are the hostages being released in stages, not all at once? I mean, look, it has to do with how complicated it is to negotiate this ceasefire. We are negotiating with the devil. That's what everyone is saying here in Israel, that we are negotiating with the devil. We don't have an ideal partner. And so we need to make very, very difficult concessions. When we say that difficult choices need to be made, these are the difficult choices we're talking about. The fact that we are releasing these prisoners, many of whom have blood on their hands, have been convicted of murdering multiple Israeli Jews. The fact that they're not only being released, but being released to the West Bank. That is one of the hard choices we have had to make. Uh, the fact that we're getting them our own hostages back in stages and not all at once. We had to agree with this in order to make the deal happen. It's not our first choice, but you must keep in mind that these are the who we are negotiating with. Hamas, they're, as we say in Hebrew, "Hem lo nomalim," like these aren't normal people that we are negotiating with. This isn't another government. These are terrorists, and unfortunately, they do have some of the leverage over us by virtue of the fact that they hold the hostages. And so we are forced to agree to things that we would not want to. I think we need to have faith that the army, that the Shin Bet, that the Mossad will do their best to keep track of these released prisoners. That is what all Israelis are hoping for and praying for. But I agree with you. Logistically, it makes no sense to put them in the West Bank, where they literally could attack us again. And I'm going to mention this later on, or maybe I'll just mention it now. But it's been found that 82% of prisoners who've been released from Israeli jails go on to be involved in future terror attacks, whether it's carrying out the terror attack itself or helping to plan it. 82% of those being released. Now, in this deal, we are releasing just over 1,900 Palestinian prisoners. If 80% of them go on to commit or somehow be involved in terror, you're looking at what's the quick math say, about 1,700 potential terrorists unleashed into mostly the West Bank. It's horrible. But again, if we want to get the hostages out, we've been forced to agree to um, to do some things that we absolutely don't want to do. That's what negotiating with terrorists comes down to, and that's why there are definitely many Israelis who don't want this deal to happen. Itamar Ben Gvir left the government over this. Bezalel Smotrich voted against the deal for this reason. And there are many Israelis who, not the plurality, not but the majority, but there are a significant number of Israelis who are against this deal for just that reason. The idea of releasing 1,900 prisoners, many of whom have blood on their hands for murdering Israeli Jews, uh, to them is unforgivable and unjustifiable and a dishonor to the over 400 soldiers who've been killed fighting in Gaza. I certainly see that side of the argument. So Gila wanted to ask, can you clarify whether the released terrorists, convicted murderers, were only added to the list after Netanyahu was pressured by Trump? We all thought the previous list agreed upon were not the worst. Also, will any of them be deported and how will the IDF monitor them? So, as for the second part of the question, it seems like this is one of the concerns of you guys. What is going to happen to all of these prisoners and terrorists who are being released? How are they going to be monitored? I don't know. Here on the street in Israel, we don't know either how they're going to be monitored. What we're hoping, I can tell you what we're hoping. What we're hoping is that they are being monitored and that they will be taken down, killed by Israeli forces soon. Um, there's also a hope that we'll get all the hostages out and that soon after Hamas will launch one missile at Israel, at which point we have the full excuse and the full backing of a Trump led America to, at that point, level Gaza or go in with as much force as we want. So, Israelis many are hoping that the war will somehow continue. I hope the war somehow continues and that we can continue to destroy Hamas because we haven't yet. It's clear, but we need to get the hostages out first. So, as for Gila, your other question, when were these convicted murderers and other worst of the worst added to the list? This list has been being negotiated for a long, long time. The list of prisoners to be released. It's not something, as far as I know, that was just generated within the last week or 2 weeks, or even necessarily since November. I think Israel, for a long time, has been going over this list of who the potential prisoners to be released from Israeli jails are. And yet you have to assume that the Shin Bet, which is like the internal security, what you might call the FBI, the Mossad, which is like the CIA, and the army would not have released prisoners if they truly thought that they were in the near future or in any time in the future going to commit an attack on Israel and that we couldn't monitor them. Now, this is a lot of faith. I mean, that means putting the faith in these three branches of our defense, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, and the army that completely failed us on October 7th. I think Israelis do have faith in these institutions, and we think that they've learned many lessons since October 7th. But I agree with you that this is really the number one question on people's minds. Judy asks, I read that some hostages who were released last year have volunteered to meet with the newly released ones. I hadn't heard that, but that's truly wonderful, and it's very Israeli too. I would assume this is true. I wonder if there are plans to have Holocaust survivors also meet with hostages eventually, since of anyone on this planet, they are best able to give a longer term perspective on how to process the trauma and live normal lives. So, Judy, I don't know the answer to that. It certainly would make sense. What I will say is that there is a lot more thought this time into how we are going to help these released hostages recover from the trauma. For example, the first time hostages were released, already over a year ago, probably 15 months ago, the first time they were released, it was must see TV, and cameras were watching their every move as they drove up to the fence from Gaza to Israel. Cameras were there to catch it as they drove in to Israel and up the roads, as they got out at the army base, as they met their families, when they were in the hospital. I mean, it was like a reality TV show that the entire country was glued to. And it wasn't simply voyeurism. I mean, I was hooked on it also. We had been praying for these, our brothers and sisters, and finally they were released. We wanted to celebrate and be part of the joy of seeing our fellow citizens released from bondage. But this time, there is none of that. So that's a big difference. Is you cannot turn on the TV right now and watch live footage of the hostages being this and that. The media is been instructed to keep their distance. We're seeing a few photographs, maybe a hug, each of the girls hugging their mother, and we're seeing them get out of the van in Israel and being met by the army as they're released from the Red Cross, like a 1 minute video. But it's not must see TV the way it is last time. So the part of the trauma I can talk about is that we are being much more prudent and much more cautious about how we go about helping these hostages process the trauma. They're being kept for observation in the children's ward at a hospital in Tel Aviv because it's the quietest one, it's the easiest one where they can have privacy. Um, so there really is a lot of thought going into how they're going to transition back into normal life here in Israel, if they ever can have a normal life, and not have it be a media circus, and not give them another set of traumas, which is having their lives, broadcast all over the country after going through these, harrowing 470 days of hell. So that's the part of the trauma and recovery that I'm noticing here. Judy had another question. Ben Gvir's party left the coalition. That's the far right party of Itamar Ben Gvir, who is the minister of the police. So does this mean that Ben Gvir no longer heads the police? Does this bring down the government? So yes, Itamar Ben Gvir left the coalition, left the government essentially, because he is against this deal going through. And what does this actually mean? And the reason he's against the deal is because he feels it's not a good deal that releasing convicted murderers who could, God forbid, enact more terrorist attacks against Israelis is a, a deal that is not acceptable. And so the question is, is he still now the minister of police? At this moment, he is, but I think Tuesday morning he officially is not. So as of Tuesday morning, Ben Gvir will not be the minister of police here in Israel. Now, what I've heard is that Netanyahu will appoint a Likud party member to hold the position temporarily, and that very soon Itamar Ben Gvir and his party will rejoin the government again, and he will be given back his position and as minister of the police. But as of Tuesday morning, he will no longer hold that ministerial position. Last comment Judy has: I hate the IRC, that's the International Red Cross, gets all this good PR for picking up the hostages in Gaza when they did absolutely nothing to help along the way. And with that, Judy, I could not agree more. I'm 100% with you. The Red Cross has been a huge disappointment. In the olden days, I've mentioned this before, I would give money to the Red Cross here and there when there was a hurricane or relief was needed. No longer. They're an anti Israel, anti Semitic organization. You can give your money elsewhere. But yeah, I'm with you. Harold, right. I don't trust Hamas with the lives of the remaining hostages. If the deal includes dead and alive hostages, what's going to prevent Hamas from killing more hostages before they are released? That's a great question. And what Harold is referring to was the fact that in this first stage of the hostage deal, we're to receive 33 hostages from Hamas in exchange for these 1,900 Palestinian prisoners. And these 33 prisoners, these 33 hostages, we do not know how many of them are dead and alive. The army supposedly knows how many, but it's not all of them. Not all of them are alive. We are assuming and sort of bracing ourselves for the bad news that some, if not several, if not many of them are not alive, that we will be getting body bags back. And I'll explain in a moment logistically how this hostage deal is actually going to play out. So your question, why wouldn't Hamas just start killing hostages? before they're released so that all we get back are dead hostages? I don't know the answer to that. My hunch, Harold, is that if at some point, if it got to the point where Israel saw that all it was getting back was body bags and not living hostages, that could hurt Israel's motivation to continue on to stage two of this deal. And what ultimately Hamas wants is to come back into power in Gaza. As much as you might turn on the news and see a lot of cheering of Hamas and, gun waving and firing and all that, Hamas has been badly, badly hurt. And Gaza has been decimated. I think 90% of the infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed. So we have leverage over Hamas as well. They want this war to end. Their only chance for surviving is if the war ends. And so I think it is in their interest to return living hostages. And I think, they're very conscious of PR as well. Hamas, unfortunately, maybe more than Israel, is conscious of PR and how PR works. And if they start returning dead hostages, especially the Bibas children, the two redheaded children who are the youngest of the hostages still in captivity, if they all start coming back in body bags, this is bad PR for Hamas. So that might be the reason that they would not just start killing the remaining hostages. Harold also sent me a headline from ABC News. So not the BBC, which we know is anti-Israel, but this is ABC News in America. And ABC News wrote, marking an end to more than 15 months of deadly conflict, Israel and Hamas reached a ceasefire deal on Wednesday that includes the release of captives held by both parties. And what Harold was pointing out is that the prisoners being held in Israeli jails are referred to as captives, the same way that our hostages, Romy and Daron and Emily and the others, are referred to as captives, which is unforgivable. Because these prisoners, many of them, like I said, have blood on their hands. They are murderers. They are rapists. They are terrorists, jihadists. And to equate them in any way with Emily, Doron, and Romy and the others it's not even a mistake because that just shows such complete ignorance. And to think that this is what our media is composed of these kinds of people, um, uneducated, and really uncommitted to what real journalism should be. But hey, that's why you're joining me right now, right? So you don't have to deal with them. Okay, one more comment question. This is from Michelle. Michelle writes, I'm actually here in Israel right now, volunteering with SAR L, which is an army program where adults actually do work on army bases, packing backpacks and sorting uniforms and doing laundry and a lot of scut work, but it's work that we actually need from you. And Michelle writes, although I watched for news releases, there was very little celebration on this army base when the hostages were released, even among the volunteers. Why do you suppose that is? And I must say, Michelle, all over Israel, it's a muted celebration. We are not breaking out into song and dance. The families of these hostages are, and their friends. And you might be able to see some video of the friends of hostages spontaneously breaking out into some dancing and smiling. But for the rest of the country, I mean, this is three down, 97 to go. And we know that there are so many more hostages left. And when we saw that footage of the three girls being transferred from Hamas to the Red Cross, and we saw the militias of the Hamas armed gunmen in their fatigues and their masks and sunglasses with their AK 47s touching the girls, having their hands all over them and shoving them, and the people cheering in the streets in Gaza. It just reminded us of the hell that they went through, but of the hell that the 97 others are still enduring. So we don't see it as a time for celebration. I mean, this is so bittersweet. And that's why you're not seeing just mass explosions of song and dance here in Israel, because that's not what it is for us. It's completely bittersweet. Okay, that's it for the questions. Let's go on to the meat of the episode here. So, this hostage deal, what is it and how does it actually work? So, here's what we know at the moment. At the moment, the three girls, Romy, Doron, and Emily, are now back in Israel. They're in Tel Aviv at the hospital, undergoing their first examinations. So that would bring the number of hostages down to 98. However, this morning or last night, in a very daring IDF raid, the IDF was able to recover the body of Captain Aron Shaul. He is an officer in Golani who was killed, I believe it was 10 years ago now, in Gaza. And his body had been held for 10 years. And his body was recovered. And he was counted among the 101 Israelis in Gaza. So now that his body is back in Israel, and I believe his funeral was today or is tomorrow, the number now stands at 97 hostages in Gaza, 34 of whom are pretty much confirmed to be dead. So that means 63 living. That's where we stand at the moment. The deal itself, how does it actually work? So there are two stages. And in the first stage of the deal, 33 Israeli hostages will be released in this first phase. Now, what I want to make clear is that this first phase is 42 days long. And the hostages, as one of our questions pointed out, are not being released all at once. The way it's going to work is three were let out today. And then this coming Saturday, so long as no one breaks the ceasefire, this coming Saturday, which is the 25th of January, another 3 to 4 Israeli hostages will be released, and so on for the next 6 weeks. So this is harrowing to the Israeli people that every week, what we went through today, this emotional roller coaster of waiting for them to come out, watching them being hounded in Gaza City by those animals, and then being transferred and driven into Israel, and then reuniting their families and following the news, trying to see what's happening. We're going to have to go through this for 5 more Saturdays until all of the 33 are out. And again, the 33, that includes living and dead. So there will definitely be some very, very difficult Saturdays when we get one of those threes in a body bag, or maybe all 3 or 4 are in body bags. So it's gut wrenching that we need to go through this emotional roller coaster for the next 42 days. And that's another reason there was no celebrating, not real celebrating, because it's still going on. So, in this first 42 days of the deal, 33 Israeli hostages will be released. From now on, it's going to be 3 or 4 every Saturday for the next 5 or 6 Saturdays. During this time, the IDF is able to keep soldiers in Gaza on the Philadelphia corridor. This is the corridor, the border between Egypt and Gaza. This is important because this is what will prevent Hamas from rearming. And this also shows that we have some leverage on Hamas, that for all their shenanigans and flag waving and rifle firing, that they had to give in to this. They had to make some concessions here too. The fact that the IDF is allowed to stay in Gaza and allowed to be in the Philadelphia corridor between Egypt and Gaza, that's not insignificant. We also have soldiers positioned throughout Gaza during this 42-day period. On day 16, today is day 1. So I guess in 2 weeks from today, a little after, On day 16, we'll begin negotiations for stage two. So, stage two would only happen in 42 days. That means all of the hostages who are not part of that original 33, they really have no hope of getting out for another 6 weeks. What is stage two? So on day 16, we're going to start negotiating stage two. What happens in stage two? Nobody really knows. Stage two is supposed to be where we negotiate an end to the war, a complete withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza, and a release of all the remaining hostages. No one knows how long stage two will last. I personally think it would take much longer than the 6 weeks that stage one is going to take. There are many in Israel who believe that stage two will not happen at all, that after stage one, the fighting will resume, and that at that point, Israel will attempt to just flat out destroy Hamas, perhaps even at the risk of losing our remaining hostages. And this goes back to why Hamas would return living hostages, because if they keep returning dead hostages, then we would have no motivation to even negotiate a stage two. And believe me, Hamas does want Israel out of the Gaza Strip. So in stage two, this is supposed to be where we negotiate an end to the war completely, withdrawing the IDF from Gaza completely, releasing all of the hostages. And like I said, many are confident that many believe that this wouldn't actually happen at all. Now, the other side of the argument is that we should negotiate an end to the war quickly and as quickly as possible, bring the IDF out of Gaza, get all the hostages released. And as one ex general in Israel here said, he said, Gaza isn't going anywhere, meaning it's not like we're going to lose all hope for ever destroying Gaza and or Hamas. Let's get our hostages out and then we can attack Hamas. Then we can level Gaza if we need to. And this is the position that I personally subscribe to. Gaza isn't going anywhere. Let's get the hostages out and then figure out what to do about Gaza. I don't necessarily see that happening, but this would be the position that I subscribe to, and probably a lot of Israelis as well. In any case, stage two is very vague. There are no actual deadlines, and no one really knows how long it would last or whether it would last, um, whether it would go into effect at all. But that supposedly is what would bring the rest of the hostages home. The IDF leaving Gaza completely, and I'm not sure I see that happening so long as Netanyahu is in power. So, who is being released in this first phase? In stage one, we have 33 hostages being released. Who are they? This is called the humanitarian phase. So, women, we had 3 women released today: Doron, Emily, and Romy. Women soldiers, including the young woman from Ra'anana, who my family knows a little bit, Naama Levi. The elderly and the sick. Now, if you look at the 33 hostages who are going to be released during these next 42 days, you see a lot of young men on this list as well. And when we see young men on the list, it worries us because we know these young men are on the list because they are very sick. It's known that a couple of these young men have uh, very serious medical conditions. One of them has ulcerative colitis and has been without his medication for. I heard he has a very serious case, and he's been out without his medication for 16 months now. God willing, he's still alive, but it also wouldn't surprise us if he were the one of the ones to come back not alive. The other young males on the list, they're all there because they are very, very sick. And just that's just one of the nuances that we in Israel are paying attention to as we look over the list of the 33 and try to figure out who's coming out and who isn't. So why is this deal so difficult for Israel so difficult for us Israelis? And it is very, very difficult. One reason is the sheer number of Palestinian prisoners being released. As I said, 1900. Another is that it's very slow. That in this first stage alone, it's going to be 42 days. We now have to wait 6 more days before 3 or 4 more hostages are released. And we don't even know who those 3 or 4 are. And we don't know if they're alive or dead. It's emotionally gut wrenching for us here in Israel. And I'm sure for you as well. As I mentioned before, the idea that 82% of past prisoners who've been released from Israeli jails have gone on to commit terrorist attacks again, somehow been involved in terror. That makes this very difficult for for us. And it's the fact that we really don't know if all the hostages will ever come home. So, like I said before, this is not a time for celebration. It's bittersweet, but there's so much left still to do. A few other notes before I wrap this up. One is President Trump, who will be inaugurated tomorrow. I really got to say, I don't think this deal would have happened if Harris had won the election. I think Trump does deserve a lot of credit for making this happen. Why is this? I think Trump was able to have influence on Netanyahu to make a deal that Biden and Harris did not. Netanyahu so badly wants Trump's affection and partnership. And I think Trump and his team pressured Netanyahu, basically saying, don't count on us to always be there for you if you don't make this deal happen. And so I think Trump was able to make, I got to tip my cap to him. I grew up a Democrat. I'm not a Trump fan in general uh, because I think, of his personal behaviors toward women and etc. But I got to say, fair is fair. I tip my cap to him now. And I'll even go further. I'm glad he won the election because, as someone mentioned to me this week, America can survive 4 years of uncertainty, but Israel cannot. I think it's good that for Israel, that Trump is in power. And I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad he won and not Harris. If I lose a lot of listeners and subscribers on that, that's how it goes. So why must Israel ultimately take this deal? Like I said, it's really hard to make a deal when you know that 1,900 prisoners are being released and that not all the hostages are going to come home alive. But we have to do it to heal ourselves. There's no way that this country can move forward without bringing as many of the hostages home as possible. We need that closure and we need that sense of knowing that we did all that we could. So ultimately, it would be more harmful to Israel's soul as a country and to us living here if we simply leveled Gaza, hostages included. We need to do what we can to bring them home, even if right now the price is very high, and we're just gonna have to figure out later how to deal with the terror problem. Some final thoughts. Right now in Israel, this is just an emotionally harrowing time. I mean, today you could feel something different in the air as we were waiting for these 3 girls to be released. But now we know we have to go through it all over again next week and that we have 6 days before the next 3 or 4 come out. But we're all feeling these mixed emotions of, on the one hand, the joy, but at the same time, the real sadness that so many are still there, and this sense of failure that we haven't brought them home yet. On the news, as I was watching the news, the reporters on the news were visibly emotional. Some of them clearly holding back tears or even breaking into tears. At point, one of the news reporters started making fun of the Gazans in a way that I think Americans would call politically incorrect or bigoted, but all of us here in Israel kind of knew what he meant. He said something like, "Yeah, the Gazans can go on eating their baklava and making their noises, but we know that human life matters, and there's nothing more important than reuniting these girls with their families. So we're not going to pay attention to the masses of Gazans cheering in the street." And it definitely struck me as a non-political kind of comment for a news reporter to make, but we all get it. One thing I noticed watching the girls being transferred from Hamas to the Red Cross and just seeing, as I said, how Hamas was pushing and shoving the girls and had their hands all over them, and they were in camouflage with their guns and their masks. How does the world not see who the good guys are and who the bad guys are? I mean, how can anyone look at that and think there's anything vague about the conflict? How can anyone think it's about freedom fighting or rights or equality? How can anyone think it's about anything but jihad and terrorism and hatred of Israel and Jews? The images are so clear, and anyone who doesn't see that is simply ignorant or doesn't want to know it. One final thought is I actually went for a nice long walk tonight in the Park Ra'anana. I just, after such an emotional day, I was crying and Dorit was crying as we were watching the news earlier, even though there wasn't a lot of footage of the girls. What we were learning, when the news anchor announced the girls are now on Israeli soil, I broke down crying, and I'm sure a lot of people here in Israel did. So I just took a little breather tonight and went for a walk in Park Ra'anana. And as I was walking there, I saw two things that caught my eye. One is an Arab family walked past me in the park speaking Arabic, and they seemed super friendly, and the kid was on a tricycle and nice, no problem. But it occurred to me, this isn't going away. The idea of us separating from the Arabs, the Palestinians, that's just not possible. We're too deep in, we're too intertwined. This saga is going to be with us in some form or another for years to come. And the other thing I saw in the park was a group of boys, about 60 boys, taking part in a kosher kravi training course. Kosher kravi is pre-military fitness. A lot of boys and some girls, when they're 16 and 17 years old, they'll take a special army fitness course with former army officers, where they basically go through all the physical, really grueling exercises that they will encounter on their tryouts for the very elite units in the army. So the kids were, crawling on the grass and carrying each other over their shoulders, and wind sprints. I mean, it did not look fun at all. But I see these all the time. The park is always filled with these kind of groups doing this kind of training. And by the way, the kids pay for this. They pay, their families pay good money for their boys and daughters and sons to their boys and girls to be in these courses. The hope being that they will qualify, because these kids want to qualify for the most elite units in the army. And it just struck me, these are the kids who might be fighting those very Hamas militants that we saw on the screen today, waving their guns. And so, in that way, the narrative is going to continue in that sense also. These 16 and 17-year-old boys were running wind sprints in Park Ra'anana, hoping to get into the best units. They could be the ones fighting Hamas, Hezbollah, our other enemies over the next few years. It wasn't lost on me. All right there in the park. I want to thank all of you for joining me and for sending in your questions. It's been a really big emotional day here in Israel. I'm sure for you as well. The episode that's going to air this Wednesday on Apple and Spotify is actually not this episode. This is sort of a special broadcast just on YouTube Live. This recording will be up on the website, on my website, tomorrow. That's joelchasnoff.com. If you know someone who didn't catch it tonight but wants to watch it, or if you want to watch it again. But the episode that runs on Apple and Spotify is going to be completely different. That drops on Wednesday. So check that out. And that's actually an interview between me and one of my producers on the podcast. Her name is Yael, and she's interviewing me about my own story, my service in the IDF as a lone soldier, my two moves to Israel, moving to Israel with my family, my life here right now, writing Crybaby Brigade, writing Israel 201, stand-up comedy in around the world and in Israel. So it's sort of a deep dive into my own life, my own journey, being moderated by Yael. So I encourage you to listen to that. That's going to be on Apple and on Spotify on Wednesday. Subscribe to the podcast on those platforms. You should also, I encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. That way you'll always get updates of when I do these YouTube lives. Again, thanks so much for joining us. We're very thankful for the 3 girls who are out and very thoughtful of the 97 who still are yet to come, and we are praying for them. I'm Joel Chasnoff signing off from Israel. This has been Inside Israel. Lahitraot, everyone.